This is the institution where I did my doctoral studies, the Institute of Education, with Harold Rosen and Jimmy Britton. That was in the 1970s. There were debates raging then about the curriculum, about what form it should take. Should it be subject? Should it be areas of experience? And they continue. I wrote a report in the, now 10 years ago, called All Our Futures. I didn't write it, I wrote it with other people. I had a fantastic team of people around that report where we tried to wrestle with the issues of what would constitute a proper education for the 21st century. It was, if I can say so on behalf of that entire group, a fantastic report, which the government promptly tried to bury. The report was about creativity, and I know at the time that the then Secretary of State for Education, David Blunkett, he commissioned the report, and I think they did it in the heady first flush of government because they didn't want to go down in history as grad grind. And they responded to the idea there should be a more creative approach to education, but I know for a fact, from conversations I had with the department at the time, that they were hoping that we'd be recommending a strategy for creativity in schools which wasn't too disruptive, that could be accommodated within the existing national curriculum. Of course, the whole argument we're putting forward in the report was that creativity is really just a metaphor, in our view, for a different way of thinking about intelligence and ability and children and the world that we live in. Our current systems of education were not designed with the 21st century in mind. They were designed with the 19th century in mind and intended specifically for the 19th century. And successive governments have resolutely refused to question the core assumptions of education. What they all seem to believe is that we simply have to improve what we've got and have a better version of it, that the problem somehow is to do with standards, and that if we could just tidy up and sharpen the current curriculum, all will be well. The current system of education is based on a series of assumptions that are irrelevant, pretty much, to our current circumstances. I was hopeful when the last government got in. Tony Blair kept talking about creativity, and we thought this was good. And then, when he got into office, he reappointed Chris Woodhead, which we thought was not good. And it was not good because the approach to education that was embodied in Ofsted at the time was not only incompatible with what we were arguing for, it was directly contradictory of it. It was an approach to education based on pretty much the old grammar school curriculum, spruced up with standardized tests. And if we know anything about being creative, it's very hard to do that if you fear that the consequence of it will be that you'll be sacked. When we were doing All Our Futures, I remember we had, again, some white-knuckle conversations with the members of the administration. I remember one of them saying to it, it's very important you don't say anything in the report about Ofsted. And I said, well, that's going to be tricky, really, because you can't promote creativity and innovation if you don't address the issues of assessment and accountability. And if we don't talk about the way that the current approach in Ofsted is persecuting people in schools, then the profession will conclude that either that we've been bought off or we've gone round with our eyes shut. And one of those two things will be true. But we won't say silly things about Ofsted, because I believe the approach to education that was embodied in that report and the work I've done since is absolutely available for accountability and public assessment and all the rest, and actually contributes to much higher standards than we get with the old form of education. I'm just telling you this because there was an opportunity for this government coming in that they would realize that. It's a great disappointment to me that this administration, the coalition, has simply reverted to type in believing that the form of education our children most need is the form of education that senior members of the cabinet had when they were at school. When Michael Gove wants to frighten the country about the decline in educational standards, he talks about how few people get into Oxbridge, as if getting into Oxbridge were in itself the ultimate goal of every person in the country, and that if we could only expand the walls of Oxbridge and build some more annexes, the whole country would be delivered safely into the future. I believe that we've had a succession of Secretaries of State for Education who seem to know little about education, apart from their own education. What most administrations in England think they mean when they say, let's get back to basics, is a set of subjects. And of course, we know which ones they mean. They mean English, maths, and science. And latterly, people talk, in the interest of being groovy, about STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math. And I've heard medicine put on the end of that now. So there's a double M at the end of it. There is this problem of certainly of over-specialization in the face of the increasing acceleration of knowledge. But I believe that the way that we have to deal with it in education is not to go backwards to a subject-based curriculum. It's not like we don't know. We do know what works in schools, and we do know that there is a better alternative to these narrowly conceived subject-based curricula which enshrine a hierarchy. What happens here, you see, is that governments come in and treat education as a political and then an administrative issue. And they compose schemes without really thinking about the underlying issues, I believe. They revert to type, they go to default, and then they treat the whole thing as a logistical problem. And of course, that's what happens very quickly. The curriculum, which is meant to be a map of knowledge, quickly turns into a managerial device. It becomes a tool for organizing things. And it disappoints me deeply, truthfully, that this government coming in, facing the challenges that it faces, with the needs that our children have, which are probably more considerable than ever, facing a future that's more uncertain than ever, should have been so scandalously negligent, I think, in its composition of the curriculum. Now, the curriculum is not everything. If you think of it, there are sort of three big bits to education. There's the curriculum, which is what it is we want children to learn. There's pedagogy, which is how we help them learn it. And assessment, which is how we figure out how they're getting on, what their progress is. What typically happens when governments come in is that they decide to go into command and control mode, and they specify the bits they can, which is the curriculum, and more often than not, they start with the idea of subjects. That's the bit they don't question, that there are subjects to be taught, and I think we should question that. But the truth is, the only thing that ever makes a difference in education is teaching, the quality of teaching. And I don't know a system in the world, indeed nor does anybody else, that isn't successful because of its great teaching, or because it isn't, or it's unsuccessful because the teaching isn't quite up to standard. And that's often to do with who you recruit and how you promote and how you support and provide people with professional development. This template won't do, but it's the one that we've got. And I think it's important, therefore, that teachers and school principals and people with responsibility for implementation, I think it's worth still pitching the battle to see if this framework can be changed, but you have to operate within it for the time being. We all expect if our children are educated, they'll be in a better position than otherwise to get a job. We all want that. I mean, I do. We all want our kids to be economically independent. Well, the issue is, though, what type of economies will they be living in? And if we know anything about these current economies, they are economies that will depend upon adaptability and creativity and flexibility and innovation. And although creativity is by no means confined to the arts, and we spent a lot of time in All Our Futures saying that, it seems to me pitiful that this conception of the English Baccalaureate makes no provision for the arts in it. That design and art and music and dance and theatre can be completely ignored by schools who are promoting the interests of the EB. Now, in many systems, that's simply not the case. In Scotland, for example, the arts are foursquare with the rest of the curriculum. And it seems to me probably the worst time to be cutting away at the arts in schools. The economies depend on the kinds of things the arts teach, but they're also deeply important for the second main purpose of education, which is cultural, which is helping people to engage with their own cultural values and to understand the cultures of the world around them, where they've come from and how they might relate to the worldviews and values of other people. But the third big role of education is personal. In the end, all education is personal. It's about individuals, that all children are different, like all people are different. If we know anything about the ecology of humanity, it's rooted in diversity. And the problem with a lot of our school systems is they're based on conformity and standardizing. And the only way you really properly embrace diversity in education is through personalizing education. And that's the function of great pedagogy. I think the arguments for a creative education have never been more important than they are now. Our education systems currently, I say, were devised in the 19th century. But our children and we collectively face challenges which are unique in human history. The economic issues of sustainability, the cultural issues of coexistence and of cultural sustainability, and the issues of self-fulfillment have never been more important. And we simply can't meet those challenges with a 19th century curriculum grounded in the methodologies of the fast food industry in terms of standardizing. What we need is a customized process of education built around the talents of each child in the system. And that's a process of personalizing. And I think the roles of teachers have never been more important. We know, I think, what works. If the government doesn't understand it, then we have to do our best to get them to understand it. But in the meantime, we can't wait for them to change. We have to be the change that we want to see.
In terms of the battle that you have been fighting all these years, internationally, because I know that you go around the world and look at systems all around the world, do you think you're winning? Do you think you're winning the argument for different ways of thinking about learning?
Yes. One of the reasons I feel optimistic is I really do believe that there is a sort of shift of consciousness out there. I feel that's true of this generation. And there are the tools to make it spread. You know, the social media can be great agencies for change. Because our generation has been agitating, not all of us, but a lot of us, for different ways of looking at the world and seeing things. And I travel a lot. I get the opportunity to do that. And the conversation that I know you've been having today, this sort of conversation is happening everywhere. People across South America trying to figure this stuff out, in Asia, all across Europe. I think what people are recognizing is that, and we're all seeing it, is that there are limitations. People have tended to make too many assumptions about what governments are capable of doing. And I keep saying to people, don't wait for the government to work this out, because they might not. This is about action on the ground and doing things. And I am confident about it, because I see people everywhere doing it. A lot of things that I think Opening Minds talks about, and certainly things I talk about, have been part of the kind of counterculture in education, which is quite a considerable movement since there has been any form of formal education, right back to Montessori and Dewey and beyond that. And so I think I feel a momentum building. I hope I'm right to feel it, but I do feel it.
One of the things that blocks the conversation is a false dichotomy, which people like Michael Gove are pretty fond of, which is knowledge versus anti-knowledge. And those of us who want to argue for a curriculum which is more relevant to children, more practical. I'm interested in how you think we should talk about knowledge.
Well, the reason I don't like the idea of subjects, for example, is that it tends to, the word suggests that you can differentiate the curriculum purely on the basis of information or propositional knowledge. I mean, history is not just a bag of content. It's a discipline. It's why history is so contested. History is a process of reflection, of evaluation, of the weighing of evidence, of the use of analytical tools. Dance is not a subject. It's a way of being. It's a discipline. So I find disciplines better. But I don't see any distinction between propositional knowledge and aesthetics or the application of ideas. It's all one. To be creative, you have to be in control of it. So I just think it's based on a completely false premise that you can somehow lift information out of the world and pin it to the wall like a butterfly and get people to study it. And that's, in the end, what the old academic curriculum was too much about. It's what we're trying to get away with. But it's not about the difference between skills or not skills. It's about the integration of knowledge.
When I was in government, one of the things that happened was that schools were given a power to innovate, and they had to apply to the department for the power to innovate. And we found out that 90% of the things that schools applied to the department for the power to innovate was a power they already had. They weren't innovating, even though the space was there. And so I suppose my final question is to kind of ask you for a kind of message of encouragement for people who feel that actually you can and you should find the spaces, even in constraining systems, to innovate.
I do agree with you that schools have much more freedom, I think, than they imagine. It doesn't, for example, and what I always what I plead with head teachers is that you see the freedom that you have. That, within the system, there have always been fantastic schools, often working in very difficult circumstances. There isn't anywhere in the national curriculum or in any of the documents that I know of that says that you have to divide the day up into 40 minutes, that you have to do the same thing every week, that because the arts aren't in the baccalaureate program, you can't teach them. I think you're quite right about this. There's much more room for innovation, and I think we get enthralled a bit to government. I know it's easy to say it because the rewards go in one particular direction, and I think the best thing governments can do is create the right enabling framework to allow people to do the job that the government themselves is not doing, because kids in the end aren't going to school in the committee rooms of Westminster. They're going to school in these classrooms in Knowsley and places like that. And I think at the moment we have to refresh our enthusiasm for this and see that no matter who's in power, kids can't postpone their childhood while we wait for somebody else to figure this out. We have to do it.